if the restrictions is on the output, that matters. So output. Then the next thing I would say is, what do we mean substantive? Well, what I would want to say, the way I would analyze it, if you were to own that asset yourself. Now, it's different. Let's say, for example, I happen to be Syrian, and I buy a car, and I would drive to Syria, and I'm a small part of the population that would do that. If you're an outlier, probably say that's different, right? So the question I would be looking for is, are you an outlier or not? If you're not an outlier, and the typical owner of the equipment would have the flexibility to do those things, then you would probably say the right is not protective, it's substantive. I think it's very difficult to use the legal definition because it's from a different angle. So I think the problem we have with IFRS is we're not using enough common sense. Right? The large accounting firms sometimes, the problem with the big accounting firms is they keep looking to the U.S. for guidance, and the U.S. has all of these detailed rules, and they say, well, the Americans do it this way, it must be correct. And the problem with that approach is the detailed rules in the U.S. is not IFRS. So my view is apply common sense. Is the output restriction that someone typically would find a nuisance? That is probably more than protective. Do you have a specific example on that? On the output restriction?
I'm still confused with that question.
So what's the question?
The output, if you're putting restrictions on the input, in a way those are also restrictions on the use of it.
Correct, but
and those are going to impact the output as well.
Correct.
So I'm stuck there.
Well, I was stuck there as well. So the example that I had, many types of products you get from vendors, they want you to use their consumables. So I'm talking about the consumables. So the big four that I was looking at, because I was arguing this one, because I took the point of view, if I can't use any consumable I want, to me, you have an issue here up to direct how it's used. That was my issue. So then, when you look at IFRS 16, the examples there about restrictions are all output examples. So the great thing about IFRS is they don't give you a lot of black and white, right? So, and I'm not saying you couldn't have a different perspective, but in the standard, they specifically give examples on to change the output that is produced, the output when, where, and how. They don't give examples where there is a restriction on the consumables. So when I had this debate with a friend of mine who's a technical director at one of the big accounting firms, and I said, well, it doesn't say that the input is exempt. And all I can say on this is the conclusion that the large accounting firms came to was if the restriction relates to the consumables, that's not really considered in the analysis in their perspective of being able to use the asset how you want, because when you bought the asset, you bought it with the know-how that it had to use those consumables. That's their interpretation. So I can't give you a black and white paragraph in the standard. What happens with IFRS, as you should know by now, as time goes on, the big four get an opinion, correct? And we assume that they're correct. Why? Because that's what we do. Is that correct to do? Maybe not. So that's the consensus, I think. I'm not saying I agree with it. I can't show you a paragraph because I looked at this. I give this as a homework question to my students, and it drove them crazy. So I always write questions in my I give homework. My exam is a homework-based exam, and I always make them research the stuff I'm not sure about, see what they come up with. And it doesn't say that anywhere in the standard, That's an interpretation. So the example talks about output. So if we want to probably follow the standard of, plus you work with one of the big four, right? So you have to do what they say anyways. I think we would probably conclude the output is the core area.
But I'll go with your other suggestion of using the common sense.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, is the common sense. Because my exam question was a coffee machine. They had to use a specific type of coffee. Of course, it's expensive. And from the coffee vendor's point of view, they make their money on the consumables. Like Hewlett-Packard makes their money on the cartridges. Same concept.
We actually define the control of the asset, or control over the right to use the asset.
So when to print, when to give a cup of coffee, where to put the coffee machine. That's
A number of things, like certain car manufacturers, luxury car manufacturers, they even do the profiling of their customers. They don't even sell to certain customers. So it means that those cars cannot be leased.
they won't allow you to
They don't allow you to use it in a particular way.
for a car.
For example, Rolls-Royce says that we will not sell it to people below certain income class. So how
Even
do
for
we
cash.
calculate this?
They do that?
Profiling is there, yeah.
Yeah. Well, first,
I'm talking about the lease transaction. It is a sale transaction.
yeah, that's just
They have the right. They can.
No, I'm saying, can that kind of asset be?
If there is a restriction that they are selling a car to someone and saying that you cannot lease it to, or you cannot give it to use
to that category of customer.
you cannot give it to use it to a person who is below a certain level, then it might be a case. But
Yeah, exactly.
in case of sale, they always have the right. They can sell to anyone they want to. Or
And to me, that's not a leasing question. But I mean, if you took it in the military context, you have some military equipment, and the U.S. government says you cannot lease that military equipment to certain countries like North Korea or certain countries that
They've
they
given us F-16, but they say that don't use for your offense, only use for defense.
See,
It took us 2 weeks to prove that we use it for defense. Last February.
well, so I would say when the government is imposing something at a government political level, and it's not done at a commercial level, I would tend to say that's different. I mean, the restrictions that they refer to in IFRS 16 are not politically imposed restrictions by government. That's different. So if the government, U.S. government says, if you give someone an F-16 and they have to use it certain ways, to me that's way outside the scope of IFRS 16. So as long as who makes the F-16s? Is that Boeing? I'm not sure who makes the F-16s. I can't remember the name of the company. But whoever makes the F-16s, if they give it to you and you can use it without restriction from Boeing's perspective, or if the restrictions there are because of a law from the U.S., to me I would say that's a bit different. I wouldn't take that to be a restriction from the vendor. That's illegal. That's an issue of, like right now the U.S. companies, they can't give licenses to the Chinese Hua. Right? They stopped the technology they're transferring. I would keep that stuff separate. So is it from the vendor's perspective, or is it from the vendor's perspective? That's where I would stop. I would draw the line there. Otherwise, it's going to get too messy. And again, I'd focus on the outputs, not the inputs. Question? Okay. So we've concluded it's not based on inputs. It's based on outputs. Yes.
Suppose the example you gave, like the car in Syria and the coffee machine. The asset, if the user, the one who acquired the asset, use it the other way, it might cause damage to the asset. Like if he takes the car to Syria, it might get destroyed. And if he uses ingredients other than the prescribed one, it might harm the coffee machine.
Correct.
But what's the other way? If the seller the lessor imposes the restriction
Have no impact, yes.
So what would in that case?
Yeah, this is the issue I was talking about. So the standard focuses on the restriction being output-driven, not input-driven. So if someone leases you a machine and wants you to use their consumables, that, in the view of the large accounting firms, is not a restriction in the context of IFRS 16. That's an interpretation by the Big Four. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm saying this is what's done.
But that interpretation is based on the fact that the other way may cause damage to the asset.
But it also may not. It might be a commercial decision. I mean, let's face it.
It's same as if you are purchasing a car, then you will have to use the spare parts of the same manufacturer.
But you can also get the fake Chinese ones as well.
Yes, but if the company is imposing the restriction that you will have to use the genuine spare parts, then it is not a restriction as per IFRS. That we are talking.
Correct.
That we are talking about.
Correct. Correct. So if the restrictions on the genuine spare parts, if the restrictions on the consumables, even though there could be other consumables that are just as good, the interpretation is that is not outside the scope of IFRS 16. That's the interpretation. I can't prove it to you black and white. It's not black and white. That's an interpretation. Because initially when I wrote my exam question, I was expecting that to be not a lease because of the restriction. And when I looked at the research, it actually came back, actually, it's irrelevant. Other factors need to be analyzed. So does that answer your question there? And with Siri, that's very different.